So welcome to your second lesson of this lecture. I've broken these up to make it a little easier for viewing purposes later. So if you want to sit down and watch them individually, you can. You don't have to watch them back to back. It makes it a little easier. They're still kind of long, but it's better than nothing. So in lesson 1, for week 2, we learned all about creating and deleting, moving, copying, all those things with directories and how to name directories and so on and so forth. In this lesson, or in this part of the lecture, we are going to learn all about text files. So how to use a text editor to create and edit a file, and how to manage the content within the file, both from the command line and within a text editor itself. We're going to look at some fairly simple command line ways of viewing the contents of a file. Later in the semester, you're going to learn more about how to manipulate the contents of a text file from the command line. So let's get into that. We've already talked about how everything in Linux is a file. So text editors in Linux are extremely important, and there's two common ones that we tend to use, nano and vi. So we're going to look at a bunch of commands in addition to that to manipulate the contents of a text file from the command line. We're going to look at touch, cat, more and less, cp, which we've already kind of looked at, mv, also kind of looked at, rm, we also kind of looked at that one. But we're going to look at these in particular to how they pertain to files. Diff, file, and find. We'll have some demonstrations of each of these. And all of this will map to tutorial 2, investigation 2, and the practice questions 9 to 16, sorry. And I need to edit the files after this lecture, or edit the slides after this lecture, and remove that because there is no assignment. This is left over from when I edited the ULI slides. So let me make a note about that. And I'll update that accordingly. Of course, not in your video. And there may be, as this is the first semester that this course is rolled out, you may find some typos like this and things. I'll clean them up as I come across them, but after having looked at these for quite a few hours over the summer, I clearly missed a few things. And that's pretty normal when you tend to look at documents or code for a long time. You make silly mistakes, or you miss things because you just, like, your brain doesn't see them. And having a second set of eyes here is really, really helpful. So I'll get that cleaned up, so when you view these on the live wiki later, it'll be fine. So text editors allow users to create, modify, and save text files, right? You can make changes, you can create content from nothing. You've done this before in other sort of scenarios, like creating documents through through Word and stuff like that, right? And you've possibly done some of this in programming, in your Introduction to Programming course, using a graphical IDE to code and compile your programs. And that's great, and that's an awesome way to do that too. But when you're accessing a Linux or Unix server, you're only going to have a text file or a text editor. You're not necessarily going to have access to a graphical IDE. There are ways around that. More modern text editors support graphical SFTP sessions to servers, Notepad++ being one of them, and I highly encourage that when I use it in my Introduction to Web Design course that I teach over at Centennial. But it's still important to know how to do these from the command line, just in case your work environment happens to only have that as an option. So being able to manipulate these files, especially from more of a networking standpoint, every service you install and configure in Linux, the configuration file is just a text file. So you're going to have to go in there, make some changes to the config file, and you may have to periodically change things in there to update the system appropriately as things move or as things evolve. So yeah, manipulating text files, very, very, very useful. And I already mentioned we have two editors there, Nano and Vi. So we're going to look at them each individually, along with a little demo, and then we're going to look at some file manipulation and viewing contents from the command line. So first up is Nano. Nano is, of the two, it's considered to be a lot easier to use. Because as you'll see when we look at Vi, and this is why we're looking at Nano first, when you first launch Nano, it puts you into input mode, so you can start entering text immediately. There's special stuff you have to do in Vi, which we'll look at when we get there. Any commands within Nano, and you'll see them displayed at the bottom of the window when we launch the editor, consist of control and a key, and that's represented in the editor itself with the caret symbol in front of the key that you need to hit to issue that command. So for example, Control K will cut a line. Control U will paste the copied text. Escape and 6 will copy a line. Control X will save and exit. And there's other useful ones in there too. A side note about Nano, there is no undo command in Nano. And if you want a reference to all of these, if you look at the notes on the wiki, there's a Nano reference sheet. There's also a Vi reference sheet. And a note about the reference sheet, the letter M represents the escape key. So let's have a quick look at that. I'm going to pull up my command line in my virtual machine, and I'm just simply going to create a file. I'm going to call it Nano file. I'm going to enter the text. This file was created using the Nano text editor. And you see, as I promised, you're going to have all of your reference down here for your shortcuts. So we want to save and exit this now. We could save it individually with Control and O, and that's write out, which means save, or we can do both with Control X. I'm going to go ahead and write it anyway. And note, one of the handy things about Nano is it confirms what file you want to call this. You can also invoke these commands, incidentally, on their own without an argument. When you invoke Vi or Nano with the file as the argument, it will edit the file if it exists and create that file or open a file with that name in the editor. It won't actually create the file until you save it. So I'm going to save that. And we'll take a peek at the contents using a command that we haven't quite looked at. And there's our file there. We're going to look at that command in a few minutes, so don't worry too much. Now we're going to look at Vi. So the Vi text editor, which is commonly referred to as Vim, it takes a lot longer to learn. It's got a steep learning curve. There isn't any help really within it. And a lot of the shortcuts, if you don't use them regularly, you just kind of forget them over time. I used to be really, really good with Vi. I'm not as good with it anymore. I can do some basic things like search and copy and paste and stuff like that. But anything more complicated than that, I have to go reference my Vi cheat sheet, just because I don't use it every day. But any good sysadmin, or any good programmer for that matter, will get comfortable using Vi if you're working in a Linux or Unix environment. So the main difference between this and Nano started you in input mode, so you just start inputting text. Vi doesn't do that. Vi puts you, it has two different modes. It has command mode and input mode. And it starts you in command mode. So before you can input text, you have to start, you have to hit a special button. You have to hit the letter I, and that will put you into input mode. And to get out of there, you can hit escape, and that will return you to command mode. Commands generally begin with a colon, and we're going to look at this, so it'll make a little bit more sense shortly. But to make this a little bit easier, there is a tutorial that exists in, well, it's in Murray's home directory. It's also in my home directory. And it's been around a while. It's been around since longer than I've used Linux. Murray created this about two decades ago, give or take. And it will give you some hands-on experience with command line editing. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And you're going to as part of the tutorial this week. You can also refer to, in the week 2 notes, there's a Vi command reference sheet. So let's just take a look at how to create a file and add some text. Let's keep it really simple. I'm just making some notes again, as there was some stuff there that needs updating. So I'm going to create a file called ViFile, and I'm going to input into it, so I have to enter insert mode. I'm going to push I. This file was created using the Vi text editor, kind of like we did with the Nano one. And I'm going to save that. I'm going to cat ViFile. So there we go. We have our output from our nano file there, and we have our output from our Vi file there. So we can see they are different. This is going to come in handy in the next in a few slides from now. We're going to start taking a look at some other things. We're going to be able to compare the files and the contents of them and stuff. So it's absolutely essential for you to not only be able to create text files, but how to manage them. Create empty files, copy files for purposes of backup. This one's important. Anytime that I go to configure a service in Linux, I always make a backup copy of the original template text configuration file that you get. Because if you make, if you're running into issues trying to get a service up and running, and you make a bunch of typos in it, and you change a bunch of things, maybe you've deleted some stuff, sometimes it's just easier to start from scratch. And the easiest way to do that is just restore the basic untouched, clean config file from backup. So having that as a backup, always a good thing. It's also handy to move and rename incorrectly spelled file names and edit files and be able to view them without the danger of editing them, or in some cases be able to view just particular parts of text files. If you know where something is, there's ways you can do that in Linux, which is pretty great. You also need to know how to remove files, how to compare two files and check for differences, and obtain some other information about the file, like what type of file is it. So there's a variety of commands that we're going to use to do this. Touch will create an empty file, and if a file exists and you use the touch command, it will update the file's time and date stamp, which can be helpful in certain contexts. Cat, which is short for concatenate, will allow you to view a text file or a file's contents without editing them. It's great for small files. Unfortunately, it dumps it all right out on the terminal. So if your file is particularly long, you're going to have to scroll up and down through that. Or you can use commands like more and less, and these allow you to navigate within larger text files. More will allow you to navigate down, but not back up, using your down arrow key. Less allows you to navigate both down and up. So like cat, but with the ability to scroll. Head and tail allow you to view the lines at the top and bottom of a file respectively. By default, both of these provide the only 10 lines, the top 10 or the bottom 10, depending on if you're using head or tail. But you can modify that by issuing a dash and the number, meaning the number of lines you want to see. This can be useful if you know that the text you want is within the top 5 lines of the file. You only want to see that, you don't want to see the rest of it. grep allows you to display lines that match a pattern within the file, and we're going to look at this one more in depth in a couple weeks, possibly even next week. I don't remember exactly where it falls in the overall structure, but later in the semester. CP will allow you to copy text files, just like it allowed us to copy directories. MV is move, and that will allow us to move and rename files. RM will allow you to remove a text file. And diff will display the differences between two files. This one can be really, really handy if you've got two copies of the same file and you want to see what the differences are. And there's like certain contexts where you really want to do this. Additionally, some of these we're going to look at, some of these we're not going to look at this week, but we will look at later. Sort will allow you to sort the files in an order, alphabetically by default, but you can sort by number as well by providing the appropriate option. Unique, UNIQ, displays identical lines only once. So if you have multiple lines in a file that are the same, it will only display them once. Again, useful in certain contexts. A file command is a really cool one, I think. It gives you information about the contents of a file, whether it's got an extension or not. And you can't trick the file command, as I'm going to show you a little later. You can call a text file a JPEG, you can just rename it or copy it, and the file command will still correctly tell you what is in the file. Find is useful for finding files matching particular characteristics. So with the find file, you need to provide a couple of parameters. Find, of course, is the file you want to, or the command you want to invoke. Next is the path name. So we're going to use just dot, which means here, right, our current directory. And we can search for file names beginning with or ending with a pattern. Files that are larger or smaller than a particular size. And this searches in the current directory and any of its subdirectories. And files modified within a certain amount of time. So we're going to look at some examples of that right now. So I'm just going to clear my screen because we got a ton of stuff here. And do an ls. So remember we have our vi file and our nano file here. That's important, or will become important. So we're going to create an empty file first with the touch command, and I'm going to call it sample. I'm going to do an ls to confirm that it's there. We're going to use the file command on our sample, and note it tells us it's an empty file. What does the file command tell us about our nano and vi file? Let's find out. So nanofile.txt says it's ASCII text, and vifile.txt, it tells us that it's again ASCII text, so it gives you the file name and its contents. Kind of cool. Now, as promised, I told you that you can't trick this, right? Let's try. I'm going to copy vi file and I'm going to call it .jpg, which is a JPEG. That's an image file format, right? So if we do an ls to confirm, when we view the contents here, it shows up in purple, which is appropriate in this particular terminal for JPEGs anyway. So ls, it's tricked ls. It thinks it's a JPEG. But if we use the file command on it, it's still a text file. That's interesting. And then one final thing, I promised you we're going to look at cat less and more, right? So I'm going to give you a preview of something we're going to look at in a few weeks called redirection. I'm going to just perform an ls on the /etc directory so you can see the output first. So there we go, we have the contents of etc, which as I mentioned previously is where all your important config files are. I'm going to redirect that content to a file. So instead of seeing it in our terminal, we'll see it in a file here. So ls etc, whoops, I'm going to redirect it to the file etc.txt. And just do an ls to confirm that it worked. Let's take a look at the contents. So there we go. It's similar to the terminal output we saw if we scroll through there, but notice it's everything on one line, not in our nice pretty column format that we had there. If I want to view it just like cat, but I want to scroll up and down, well, I can use more. So there we go. And Q to get out of that. Sorry, less allows you to scroll up and down. I want to view it with more. Note that we need to hit enter. We can't use our arrow keys, as I just remembered as I was doing it. I was hitting the down arrow and trying to figure out why it wouldn't work. But I can't scroll back up. So depending on how you want to do things, you may want to be able to do that. And Q to get out of that again. I'm just going to clear my screen. So let's say I want to look at the top 10 lines. Well, I can do that with head etc.txt. And that's kind of cool. But what if I don't want to look at the top 10 lines? Well, I can do head -2 etc.txt. And I just get the top 2 lines. If I wanted to see the top 5, I go do head -5 and so on and so forth. Tail etc.txt will give me the bottom 10 lines. And tail -2, of course, will give me the bottom 2 lines, which could be useful. Sort etc.txt. Now note about this, it's not actually going to do anything because ls sorts our output alphabetically by default. So this did sort it by default, but it was already sorted alphabetically, so didn't really do anything. But if we include the -r option with sort, it will sort it in reverse. And there we go. You can see it is sorted alphabetically in reverse. If you want to sort by number, you need to use the -n option with sort. So sort -n. By default, it's an alphabetic sort, not a numeric sort. I'm going to clear my screen again. So as promised, we're going to use the diff command. Now remember, if we do an ls, we have the files vi file and nano file, which are subtly different. So if we use the diff command on nano file, so it takes 2 parameters, vi file.txt. There's our different lines. Well, of course, we only have 1 line in there, so it's going to show us that single different line. If you had multiple lines and there was only that 1 line different, it would show that. If you remember, we made this etc.txt file. Use the file command on it. We can see it's a text file, ASCII text file. I'm going to clear this up again. Just do a quick ls so we see what we have in here. And finally, I'm going to give you a couple examples with the find command. So find, where do we want to look in our current directory? We're going to look for files with the name nanofile.txt. And we got just that particular file. We could use some bash expansion here, which we're going to learn about, or we did learn about. An asterisk, which it means 0 or more anything. So anything beginning with nano gives you an idea of how useful this could be. If you have a large number of files in a directory and you don't remember the exact file name, but you remember it begins with this, well, this could be useful. Find, so we want last modified, and I'm going to do just 1 minute. We got nothing. Let's try 5. Really? I guess it was more than 5 minutes that I created those. So 10 minutes, well, 10 minutes ago I created sample file, JPEG, and etc. So again, you can see this is useful. And finally, might have to play around with this one a bit too. So anything, we're looking for files of a particular size. We can provide the size parameter. And anything larger than 1K, it will just spit that out. So this could be useful if we're looking for large files, for example. For further practice with all of these, you should work on Tutorial 2, Investigation 2, and the back half of the practice questions. So it's questions 9 through 16 that are at the bottom of the wiki page. And that brings us to the end of lesson 2. Lecture 2, lesson 2, or part 2. Thank you for watching. Take care, be safe, and I will see you all in this week's lab class. Bye for now.